Hello, welcome to our presentation on media, social media, and mental health stigma. Today, our group will examine how different forms of media, such as traditional news coverage, broader public narratives, and social media spaces, can shape the way society understands mental illness. Each of us is tackling this issue from a different angle, but together these perspectives help us see how powerful stories are. The stories we hear influence what we fear, who we empathize with, who we support, and ultimately what systems and policies we believe in. Today's conversation is really about the larger idea that media doesn't just report on mental illness, it also helps define it. This presentation is divided into three connected sections that build upon each other. First, Christy will examine how traditional media frames mental illness, what gets highlighted, what gets left out, and how this pattern shapes public attitudes over time. Next, Tiara will address the question, in order to reduce stigma in the United States, do we have to change how the news media covers mental illness? This section will explore what happens when media narratives are distorted, how stigma becomes reinforced, and what might actually shift if those narratives changed. Finally, Jordan will look at social media, which is often viewed as the opposite of traditional news media. Instead of a top-down narrative, social media gives individuals the chance to tell their own stories, challenge stereotypes, and create communities that normalize mental health conversations. Together, these three sections help us understand how media stories, whether from a news network or a TikTok account, shape the public's perception of mental health, often more than direct personal experience does.
We're going to get started with what shapes public perception of mental illness. When we think about mental illness, most of what we believe does not come from personal experience. It's what we have been shown. In stark contrast, I come from a family with a history of mental health challenges and substance use. I was raised in poverty in the inner city of Cleveland, where our headlines often make national news. And what I've learned is that the way these stories are reported is incomplete. We see the headline, but we almost never see the circumstances that led up to it. Research tells us that most Americans learn about mental illness through the media, not through direct relationships or the mental health system. So before we even talk about stigma, we have to acknowledge something deeper. The media is not just reporting stories, it is shaping our reality. It is shaping our perception. It influences who we see as dangerous and who we also believe can recover. We also have to take note that the policies that are passed and justified are influenced by media. So the question is not just what gets covered, it is what gets defined as important. It's also where this conversation starts. What is important? As I said, the conversation starts here with the problem. Right now, the dominant narrative around mental illness is not neutral, it is patterned. Over time, news coverage has consistently centered mental illness within moments of crisis, particularly violence and suicide. In a 20-year analysis, 38% of stories referenced interpersonal violence, while 29% referenced suicide. But what matters is not just what's included, it's also what is excluded. Very few stories show people receiving treatment, managing their conditions, or living stable everyday lives. Instead, coverage often relies on broad, undefined labels like mental illness and places individuals in a narrative of creating danger, being unpredictable, or always in crisis. While crisis can just be moments of instability and not long term um, cases of behavior. We have to really take a look at this. What this creates is not just a pattern of reporting, it creates a pattern of perception. When audiences repeatedly see mental illness framed through violence, they begin to associate mental illness with a threat. While research shows that exposure to these types of stories increases fear, increases the desire to social distance from large groups in inner cities, and it increases the lack of support for our community members, and it increases the support for restrictive policies. So, what we're looking at is not just media bias, we are looking at forms of social conditioning. The public is not reacting randomly, They are responding to the story they have been given, and the story is always incomplete. Because when we isolate the outcome like a violent act from the conditions that led up to it, we erase the broader context. We erase factors like access to care, trauma, poverty, social isolation, and systemic gaps in support. We are not using a sociological lens to view these behavioral patterns and narratives. So instead of understanding mental illness as something shaped by our environments and systems, it becomes reduced to individual danger, and that reduction is where stigma grows. So if the story we have been given is incomplete, then the question becomes would it look like to tell a more accurate one? Are there any positive portrayals of mental illness that are equally newsworthy? The answer is, of course, yes. Not only do they exist, but they meet the very standards journalism claims to value: impact, relevance, and public interest. Recovery is newsworthy. Stories of people accessing care, managing their conditions, and rebuilding their lives reflects the reality that mental illness is not a permanent state of crisis. It is something people navigate and often something they move through. Yet those stories are rarely centered, even though they represent the majority experience. Systems are newsworthy. Access to care, community based services, housing stability, and diversion from incarceration are not background issues. They are the conditions that shape outcomes. When those systems work, they reduce harm, increase stability, and improve public safety. This is not a side story, this is the story. Our community is newsworthy. When people share when people share lived experiences, when peer support grows, and when communities actively challenge stigma, we see measurable shifts in how people think, how they engage, and whether they seek help. Those are not soft stories. They are stories of change, hope, and most importantly, empowerment. So the issue is not whether these portrayals exist. The issue is what we choose to elevate. Because if we continue to define newsworthiness by shock value, we will keep reinforcing fear. But if we define it by impact, by truth, and by what actually shapes outcomes, then the narrative expands. And then when the narrative expands, so does public understanding. So instead of asking why the media focuses on the most extreme moments, we should be asking something else. What would it look like if the most visible stories about mental health reflected not just crisis but context, not just outcome but conditions, not just fear but possibility? Because the stories we elevate do more than inform. They shape how we see people. They shape how we respond to them, and ultimately, they shape what kind of systems we build around them. If we change the story, we change the outcome. Thank you, and up next is presenter number 2. Thank you, and have a great day.
Stigma thrives in silence, but social media has created a space where people can finally speak openly about mental health. By sharing experiences, building communities, and spreading accurate information, social media has the potential to reduce stigma surrounding mental illness. Social media has created spaces where people feel more comfortable talking about mental health. These platforms allow individuals to share personal stories and experiences, which can help others to better understand what living with mental illnesses look like. And when people see real experiences instead of stereotypes, it often increases empathy and understanding. Online communities can also provide support and validation for individuals who may feel isolated in their offline lives. According to research discussed in Community Mental Health, increased visibility and discussion of mental health experiences can challenge negative stereotypes and help reduce stigma. So, how exactly does social media help reduce stigma? Social media can reduce stigma in several ways. One major way is through educational campaigns that share accurate information about mental health, and these campaigns can help to correct common myths and misconceptions and stereotypes about mental illnesses while also helping to connect individuals to resources that they may need. Another really important factor is online peer support networks. These communities allow people to experience mental health challenges and connect with others who understand their experiences, which can help to reduce feelings of isolation. Research has also shown that anti stigma programs using online platforms can lead to measurable improvements in attitudes towards mental illness. And additionally to that, When individuals publicly share their mental health experiences on social media platforms, it can increase awareness and encourage empathy among different audiences. All of these factors show why social media can be a powerful tool in reducing stigma. Overall, social media has the potential to play an important role in reducing stigma surrounding mental illness. When people share their personal experiences, it helps to normalize conversations about mental health and encourages others to speak openly as well. And personal storytelling can build empathy and increase understanding among audiences who may not have a direct experience with mental illness. Educational content shared online can help to correct misinformation and promote accurate knowledge about mental health conditions. And when used responsibly, social media platforms can help reduce stigma, promote understanding, and increase support for individuals living with mental health challenges.
There are several key ideas that connect all three sections of this presentation. First, media narratives are powerful. They shape what the public believes about mental illness, often more than direct personal experience does. When news coverage focuses on crisis, violence, or tragedy, it reinforces fear and contributes to stigma. Second, changing media coverage isn't about censoring negative stories. It's about expanding the narrative so that the public sees mental illness in its full reality, which includes treatment, recovery, and everyday life, not just crisis. Third, social media gives us a preview of what a broader, more accurate narrative could look like. When people share their experiences directly, it challenges stereotypes, builds connection, and reduces shame. Finally, if we want stigma to change on a societal level, we have to change the stories that society hears. Facts matter, context matters, hope matters, and when people are shown a fuller and more accurate picture, their beliefs shift. When the story changes, the outcome changes, and that shift is essential if we want a society that responds to mental illness with understanding, compassion, and support.